Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're moving towards the end of the month of May in the year 2017. Today is Wednesday the 24th, and we have one more week in the month, and then we'll be moving into June. I was going to say we'd be moving into summer weather, but I think we've had a little bit of that. We sure don't have it here today. It's really nippy out there, and today, windy and cold and damp, and we seem to be in a rain pattern that looks like it's going to go on for the next week anyway. But part of what helps to bring the sunshine into my life, very honestly, is being back and doing this program. I get excited about it, and I just feel so obligated and so grateful to the folks who continue to support us, and I thank you for it. We would love to hear from you. We have a phone number. And the purpose of it, obviously, is to give you the opportunity to be heard, not only by me, but more importantly by the other folks who are listening to the program, either live or on one of the archived forms, iPods or whatever. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one via email, I would appreciate hearing from you, and I'll do the very best I can to respond to you in kind. And as I've said many times, if you take the time to send me an email, I sure have an obligation to take the time to respond to it, and I will do that. My email address is wobrien906@gmail.com. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. For a little while, but I will be on it now that I'm kind of back in the groove here a little bit. If you in the search box at the top, if you type Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see the most recent ones at the top, and then they gradually go back into the ones sent earlier. As of yesterday, for the first time, we've kind of changed some of the technology a little bit in terms of doing the program, and we've had a little bit of difficulty. In fact, our programming last week was pretty because of – so what we did is install Skype on a different computer here in where I'm broadcasting from, which is a study in my – and then we've been connecting through this new version. That occurred on, I believe, Monday, during Monday's program, was that the stream went down. And, of course, we didn't know it. I didn't know it. I just kept going. But from what I understood in talking to my brother who listened to the program, was that about 2:15 in the afternoon on Monday, the program died and it was replaced by music. And since the music occurred, he assumed that the folks in this, Bob Kincaid and the folks in studios, knew that we had gone off the air. Well, in fact, they didn't, and I didn't. But there is a backup, and Bob said that there's an issue with the stream going down occasionally with Skype, but that there is a backup, and he pointed out that a number of the people who regularly listen to his programs in the evening know about the backup stream, and it's headon.live, L-I-V-E. So let me make the point here at the beginning of the program that if anything does happen to the stream, and if you lose the connection and the program seems to go off the air and you're getting music in its place, then you can go to headon.live as a backup and pick up the stream. And I didn't know that until yesterday. And I'm guessing that there are some folks, some others of you out there who didn't know that either. So I just wanted to bring it to your attention. As we do our program today, of course, we're we're still witnessing, pretty close coverage of the president's trip. Of course, today he is in Rome and met with the Pope this morning, and there were photos on the internet of he and his family meeting with the Pope. There was a couple of comments that I saw this morning to the fact that the women in the Trump family, Melania and Ivanka, wore head coverings when they had the audience with the Pope. And of course, the comment was made that when they were in Arabia, they didn't wear scarves in honor of the Muslims. So, be that as it may, it seems to be, from all the reports coming, a good trip. And I think one of the things that has happened, and it's very interesting, it seems to me, the degree to which the news and the pace of the news has changed since the president is on this trip. It appears that he, at least for the time being, has stopped tweeting. Apparently, he's put out a few tweets, but they tend to be very, very, very mild, bland, nothing provocative. But the issues and the troubles that he's been creating for himself with his tweets have pretty much abated since he's left the country. And it's really interesting because the media is being forced to cover some other things, and rather than him. He's not, in other words, taking up the entire news. And of course, some of the news is bad, like the bombing in Manchester at the concert, which, it's just, that would have been covered anyway under any circumstances. But it's getting a lot of coverage now, and it seems to me that the whole nature of our the heat of our politics has cooled somewhat since the president has left the country. It just seems to me to be almost an indication or an illustration of the degree to which our president has been able to literally suck the political oxygen out of the air ever since he's taken control. And in fact, throughout the primaries as well, as many of you will recall. There are a couple of references or articles that I'd like to begin our program today by recommending to your attention. And then I'd like to, for the balance of our program, I'd like to get back to the issue that we touched upon Monday. We spent most of our time on Monday on this, which is the issue of technology and some of the history of technology and some of the concerns and criticisms of technology. We didn't get into that. I'll try to do a very short review later in our program as we enter into it to try to bring people back and bring us all up to speed on where we were when we stopped. And then I wanted to pick up specifically on a few of the concerns about the role of technology in our contemporary world. An article or a piece that I'd really like to recommend to your attention is a piece by Tom Friedman in the New York Times that appears in this morning's Times, and it's a pretty powerful piece for I think a number of reasons, and basically, Friedman takes his cue, if you will, from the president's inaugural when he talked about America being a landscape of carnage with rusting closed factories and rusting buildings and rusting machinery and all of this stuff. The implication being that our entire economic structure is in chaos. And Tom Friedman basically uses that as his introduction for an article that he writes about a road trip that he took through Middle America. He began in a town in Indiana called Austin, Indiana, which is about 45-minute drive from Louisville, Kentucky, from the Ohio River and Louisville on the other side. He began in Austin, Indiana, went through Louisville, then down into Tennessee, and he visited Oak Ridge, where the Manhattan Project was developed. Then he basically visited Knoxville, I believe, and kind of went through there and pointed out that indeed there is some of the negative, some of the carnage, if you will, that the president referred to as inaugural, but there's also an awful lot going on, an awful lot of dynamic things happening. The article is extremely informative, it seems to me, in a couple of ways, and a couple of key ways, and some very important ways in the area of economic development. Because one of the things that Friedman addresses is the issue of economic diversity. And he points out, of course, his major theme is the need for strong, vibrant communities. His basic argument or theme is that dynamism in our economic structure, in our economy, does not come from the top down. It comes and exists within dynamic, vibrant communities. And he points out on his tour that where communities are alive and functioning, the situation is much different than the picture of carnage and disaster that President Trump referred to in his inaugural address. First thing that Friedman addresses in this particular article is the basic picture of America as we've deduced it, if you will, from the results of the last election. The assumption or the idea that America is a nation divided between the two coasts that are supposedly thriving, the East Coast and the West Coast. And the middle of America, where jobs have disappeared, drug addiction is rife, and everyone is hoping that Trump can bring back the 1950s. That's the image of America that we got as a result of the previous election. And a lot of that is based on the analysis of who voted for President Trump and why, as the polls have indicated. And many of you, I know I have seen the political map of America theoretically where the two coasts are in blue, Hillary land as it were, but the major part of middle America is red. And of course it speaks to the fact that President Trump's victory was pretty much determined by the fact that he was able to carry states in middle America that Republicans don't usually carry, like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan, for example. Those are the key states in this last election. Friedman says that the big divide in America is not between the coasts and the interior. It's between strong communities and weak ones. He said we find weak communities along the coast and thriving ones in Appalachia. So basically the conclusion is it's the kind of communities we encounter, not geography, that really paints the clearest picture of what's going on or not going on in America. He says the communities that are making it share a key attribute. They've created diverse, adaptive coalitions where local businesses get deeply involved with school systems, translating in real time the skills being demanded by the global economy. They tap into local colleges for talent and innovations that can diversify their economies, nurture their unique local assets, and consequently local foundations and civic groups step in these regions to fund fundamental learning opportunities and internships, and local governments help to catalyze all of it. In other words, these are the characteristics of a dynamic community. One of the things that I would mention, just as an observation here, is the issue of the most dynamic communities, according to Friedman, being the ones that are able to tap into local colleges for talent and innovation. Here in West Virginia, of course, West Virginia is the only state in Appalachia that is 100% in Appalachia. Here in West Virginia, that's been one of the issues that has really been a challenge. But it's not just in Appalachia. It's really been all over the country, and it's only been happening recently that we are beginning to find our way out of this. When I was in Richmond, Virginia in the 80s, in the 70s, late 70s, and through the 1980s, one of the issues that was very prominent, not only there, but throughout the nation, was the inability of higher education and the business community to communicate. They were talking beyond each other. They were not able to connect at all. Each was suspicious of the other. Higher education, to a large degree, believed that business's number one priority was to take control of curriculum away from the academics, away from the professional scholars and faculty members who controlled the academic programs in our colleges and universities. So they felt that businesses' goals were, in a sense, deceptive, that their ultimate purpose was to take control of what these institutions did. Business, on the other hand, seemed to believe that higher education, to a large degree, was set on defining for them, for business, what they ought to want. In other words, instead of responding to the needs of business in academic programming, businesses believed that higher education was on a campaign, if you will, to impose its will on business, to tell business what it should be doing and teaching and looking for in its employees. And the distrust and inability to communicate between those two entities really made economic development in this country very, very difficult. The fact of the matter is, business was criticizing higher education because the students it was getting were not able to do the things that corporations and smaller businesses needed them to be able to do. Colleges and universities, on the other hand, were exasperated because businesses and corporations were increasingly going overseas for talent rather than trying to employ their own graduates. And of course, we got to realize this comes with some exceptions. I mean, there were certain institutions and certain areas of the economy and of higher education where this doesn't apply. But we're talking about the bulk of mainstream America. In fact, in the mid-'80s, I, along with a family member, the two of us got involved and created a consulting company. And what we were basically proposing to do was bring higher education and business together. We were working in the Richmond area, and our advertising, our message to business was that you tell us what you want and we will deliver it. We will develop it and we will deliver it. We will design and tailor instruction to the needs of our clients, to the needs of our customers. And very honestly, it was beginning to work. We ended up jettisoning the business. I got a position back here in West Virginia and came back here. But the fact of the matter is, what we were doing was beginning to work. We were beginning to experience quite a bit of success in Central Virginia, in the Richmond area. And basically, this is the background that I bring to this issue. So when I read Friedman's column in this morning's Times, I'm very struck by the fact that the most dynamic communities that he finds are communities that are able successfully to tap into local colleges and universities for the talent they want. Because obviously what that indicates is that some of the problems that were so rampant in the 70s and 80s have been addressed. From where I sit here in southern West Virginia, one of the things I've seen here locally is that West Virginia has had a lot of difficulty reaching this point of communication and cooperation between business and higher education. There's quite a bit of history that is associated with this. There are many people, for example, many scholars, many academicians who believe that the whole idea of community colleges was corporate America's answer to the hostility and the negativism of higher education. Many academics believe that when business realized that it wasn't going to be able to take over control of curriculum planning in our colleges and universities, they turned their attention to the creation of their own system of higher education whose curriculum they could control. And that was really the beginning of the emphasis on community colleges, because community colleges pretty much went into the business with the goal of doing businesses bidding, as it were. The goal was to not provide higher general education training for students, the kind of education they get in four-year colleges and universities. The purpose of community colleges, for the most part, was designed to have short-term, career-focused or job-focused programming and curriculum that would really meet the needs of businesses in the surrounding communities. And I think we all appreciate the degree to which community colleges have grown in this country. When I was teaching in a community college in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s in Richmond, that's why I was there. One of the things we found is that even though that was the reason that the community colleges were pretty much in business, was to serve area businesses and companies, the fact of the matter was the bulk of our students in the community college were there with the intention to complete the 2 years and transfer to a four-year college or university. So basically, what the community colleges began, at least at the beginning, was to be a stepping stone into colleges and universities. Students clearly found that college became much cheaper, much easier to afford if you took your first couple of years at the local community colleges at minimal cost and then transferred into the four-year colleges and universities for your last 2 years. And that became pretty much what the bulk of students, at least in the community colleges that I was familiar with, that seemed to be what the thrust was in the 70s and 80s. But I do believe that a lot of that has changed, and I think the success of community college nationally kind of demonstrates that. So that's one of the first things that I would offer as commentary on some of the things that Friedman is talking about. And he's talking about strengths, but there are a couple of issues that he raises through the course of this article and his research, his trip, if you will, when he's talking to prominent people. For example, he's talking to a physician in Austin, Indiana, his first stop. And he said basically that while Austin is really down, 5% of the population is addicted to opioids, and they're trying to get out of that. But he said one of the things that the physician he's speaking with, Dr. Cook, told him was that Austin, Indiana itself was beginning to make a comeback. And one of the things that has prevented this comeback, but is now they're beginning to turn the corner, is the fact that for a long time, people in that community didn't really realize that being in the middle class required lifelong learning. That in a sense, you didn't just get a job and then just keep that job until you were old enough to retire and collect Social Security. That the economy had changed. And the traditional idea that used to be associated with a manufacturing economy out of the Industrial Revolution, that you have one employer, that's where you have your health care, you work for them for your whole working career, and then you retire from there with a gold watch. It used to be the image. He said that one of the things people in Indiana had to come to learn is that world no longer exists. And that if you are middle class, if you do have the kind of job that gives you access to a lifestyle that we would call a middle class lifestyle, it's going to require that you continually upgrade your skills, because technology and the demands of the workplace are going to be changing. And you have to be able to change with it. So basically, he said, one of the problems that they've had in that area is people failing to realize that to be in the middle class now requires lifelong learning, not just getting a job, but keeping it. And I think that's quite significant. That's really what the issue of lifelong learning is about. And as you'll recall, of course, we spent quite a bit of time here at the Virtual Center talking about the issue of lifelong learning and the idea of education focusing on teaching people how to learn rather than trying to provide them everything that they need to know. That's really not impossible because it's changing too fast. Friedman's next stop on his tour is Louisville, Kentucky. And he points out that while there are problems in this city, there are also tremendous, it's a very dynamic community. And he points out, for example, that they have quite a story to tell because they feature the fact that they claim to have 30,000 job openings, said the mayor of Louisville. And he's talking about the operation, the ability of the private sector to work with the public sector and work together and take advantage of tourism, take advantage of their industries. And they point out, for example, that Kentucky obviously is the center of the bourbon industry in America. It's the Napa Valley of bourbon, as Friedman explains it. And they've been able to utilize that and to develop it. And then to Oak Ridge, to the National Laboratory in Oak Ridge. And this is the area, one of the reasons I wanted to address this article here at the Virtual Center was because there's quite a bit in here about 3D printing and about the changes that it's causing in industry, contemporary industry, and what the message that seems to send about our education in terms of being necessary to try to keep up with it. Basically, Friedman points out that Oak Ridge is where the Manhattan Project began. And he said, I interviewed Ron Woody, county executive for Roane County, where Oak Ridge is partly located, and Steve Jones, an industrial recruiter hired by the city of Oak Ridge to seek out companies interested in investing in the region or levering spinouts from Oak Ridge's labs. And then there's quite a bit of very, very specific information here, which I want to share with you. So if you'll permit me, I'll do that. This is a quote from Woody. Back in the 1980s, you had TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it had over 50,000 employees. Now it has 10,000 employees. So we were not diversified in our employment. We had to convince the public that we can't rely on the Oak Ridge Lab and TVA alone. The Cold War's over. So our communities had to make a major transition from a lot of government programs to very few. And then Woody said, it's starting to work here. One of the success stories was luring a former 3-time Tour de France winner, Greg LeMond, and I think most of us who follow athletics at all will recognize the name Greg LeMond. He was lured to the area to open a 65,000 square foot factory for a new company, which he calls LeMond Composites, making lightweight carbon fiber bikes based on new materials pioneered at Oak Hill. The research Oak Ridge has done is going to change the way we make things, LeMond explained to Friedman. It's a really exciting future. The goal is that you will be able to go on my website and design your own bike out of carbon fiber. Now, I can read that and I can understand it, but I have difficulty envisioning it. And that's, of course, my a lack in my understanding. But, you know, there may be people out there listening to this that can understand exactly what he's talking about with carbon fiber. But then he gets into some of the areas, some of the issues that all areas have, and especially the one that I'm in. Just because there are workers looking for employment and there are new jobs opening doesn't automatically mean that local people work in those jobs. Because of the opioid crisis, many people can't pass the mandatory drug tests. Years of working for the government has left them unprepared for the pace of today's private sector. Many people can't make it, either because they're addicted or because they don't have the skills or they don't have the attitude, the proper attitude or whatever. The challenge is to match the local population with the availability with the jobs that are available. And one of the questions that arises here is the issue of the chicken and the egg, and which comes first. It's very obvious that a major employer is not going to relocate to an area where the workforce is incapable or unable to supply the manpower needs of the business. No employer, no investor in his right mind is going to open a business in a place where there aren't skilled people able to do the work needed. So the implication would be that you got to have the skilled workforce and then the jobs will come. That's the theory. A very difficult one to explain to government, because in reality, invest money in jobs that aren't even there yet. And it's very, very difficult because you don't get necessarily the immediate. You graduating people don't have a place to work because there are no jobs in the area that match their skills yet. So the trick is to bring together, is to fuse the two in such a way that they complement each other, contradicting each other. But then this discussion, a little bit more specific and relevant. I always thought the problem was more STEM skills. That's not the case. It turns out that it's not that hard to train someone, even someone with just a high school or community college degree, to operate an advanced machine tool or a basic computer. Factory managers would say, I'll train them and put them to work tomorrow in good jobs. The problem they have is finding people with the right soft skills. What are those soft skills? Friedman asked. And Woody replied, employers want someone who will get up, dress up, show up, shut up, and never give up. And there are fewer workers with these soft skills than you might think. People that are trainable. There's a mention here of the fact that many employers like to locate in farm communities because young people who grew up in 4-H clubs or Future Farmers of America have the kind of background, farming background, where they are much more likely to get up, dress up, and show up on time and never give up in a new job. Soft skills include the willingness to be a lifelong learner because jobs are changing so quickly. And this is the issue that I wanted to share with you. For instance, the Oak Ridge Lab is partnering to embed top-level local technical talent as entrepreneurial research fellows in advanced manufacturing who want to start companies in this area. Every summer, Oak Ridge's MDF, Manufacturing Demonstration Facility, hosts 100 young interns to learn the latest in 3D printing, and its experts coach teams from local high schools for national robotics competitions. Now, here's the issue on the 3D printers that I mentioned earlier. The beauty of 3D printers is that any community can now go into the manufacturing business. Traditionally, to make a car part, you first had to build a die, D-I-E. And those dies cost anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. Every die consists of a female and a male die. And the way you made a car part was to stamp the two together. There are hundreds of dies needed to make a car. And that's why an assembly line for a new car model in Detroit could cost upwards of $200 million and take 2 years to build. Sadly, that die-making industry actually moved out of America to Asia over the last 15 years, leaving only a dozen such companies left in the United States. No more. Large-scale 3D printing is enabling us to reshore that industry. The Naval Air Station at Cherry Point, South Carolina, repairs all the aircraft for the Navy on the East Coast. About a year ago, their head of engineering called me on a Monday and asked if we could print a die mold for them, and I said, sure, just send me the digital model of what you want printed. We got it by email that afternoon, and by Friday we had the mold to make the new part. And it only weighed about 40 pounds, because with 3D printing, we could make it stronger but lighter weight by hollowing out the inside. The following Monday he calls and asks me, how much did it cost and how long did it take me to make? I told him it took me longer and was more expensive to ship it to him than it was to make it. Think about car dealers in the future. Instead of needing a huge lot with hundreds of cars in the inventory, we will just custom print the car you want. Our only inventory is carbon fiber pellets that cost $2 a pound. We can make any product out of them. You won't need inventory anymore. I honestly have difficulty envisioning that. But it sounds amazing. But more importantly, it sounds doable. It sounds doable for a lot of rural areas like the one that I'm in. but it calls for a particular approach to education. It calls for people who can be trained in this highly sophisticated machine skills. But I would suggest to you, these are the kinds of things that we can educate young people to do if we just know about it. And that's why I think this particular article is so significant. I think it's one that a lot of people ought to read. This article goes on and says that this same process applies to the design of the parts. Tom Mason, director of the Oak Ridge Lab, explained to me, Friedman says, that high-performance computing allows you to design and test out all the parts on the computer and only make those that you know will work. That is so important, I think it bears repeating. High-performing computing allows you to design and test all the parts on the computer and only make the ones that you know will work. It totally speeds up the iteration loop of physical manufacturing. You move all the trial and error, all the failure into the digital world. So you don't need to do all that costly tooling of prototypes and then go straight to manufacturing. And then it talks about how the state of Tennessee has folded into these opportunities. In 2014, it decided to make tuition and fees free for high school graduates who want to enroll in any state community college or technical school on the condition that they maintain a C average, stay in school for consecutive semesters, contribute 8 hours of community service each semester, and meet with a coach or mentor who will help them stay on track to get their degree. Starting in 2018, Tennessee adults who don't already have a 2-year degree will be able to go into any state community college and earn one free as well. These are the kinds of things that are happening and can happen. And I think just being able to read an article like this, which points out some of the things that are happening, is very, very significant. But again, Friedman's message is that it's strong communities, not strong leaders at the top, who necessarily drive economic development that works. More important than that is the cooperation and communication that is beginning to exist finally between educators and business. It's always been there. Somebody just had to make it work, and it is doing that. I think it's an absolutely fantastic illustration of some of the things that are possible when people talk about bringing manufacturing back. They're not talking about the old kind of manufacturing. They're talking about this kind of manufacturing. And it seems to me we're going to have to tool up our educational institutions in order to be able to equip people to do this. And again, when you get to these challenges like the opioid situation, for example, there's no question that a significant explanation for the opioid problem rests in the fact that there aren't any jobs, or there doesn't seem to be, in the eyes of most people, the chance of ever getting a decent job. People have time on their hands, little hope, little future, little drive, little willingness to put forth any effort. And so these kinds of things, these kinds of opportunities really do promise significant payoffs not only in providing jobs, but in addressing some of these challenges like the opioid epidemic, like crime, like divided families, like spousal and child abuse, and all the rest, all these other things that no doubt stem from these kinds of situations that don't seem to have answers. I think this particular, I know from comments in the past how some people deal with Thomas Friedman. Many people see Thomas Friedman as which he is, a multimillionaire person at the top who talks down to people. But the fact of the matter is, he's really insightful, it seems to me. He has an awful lot to say. He knows an awful lot. He knows a lot of people. He's got the kind of name and reputation that can get indoors that many other people can't get into. And he's able to share with us insights and knowledge that we wouldn't get from anybody else. So again, I think we have to be very, very careful to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I think this is a very, very important article. I think it's one that all of us would be well taken to pay attention to. I don't have a hard copy of this article because this is the second article I wanted to bring to your attention today. But it's in yesterday's New York Times. And if you go to your browser on your computer and you type in Kushner Industries, Kushner, and of course what we're talking about here is President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner was president of Kushner Industries until January, when he accepted the position in the Trump administration. He surrendered his position as president of Kushner Industries to other family members. But again, and we've talked numerous times about the family issues going on within the Trump administration and the extent to which there seems to be frequent opportunities for violations of the law in the area of the emoluments clause, for example, associated with Trump's family business interests and his role as president of the United States. But in yesterday's Times, there's a major study of Kushner Industries, of that industry that was begun by Kushner's grandfather, run by his father, and then ultimately taken over by Jared Kushner himself. Kushner Industries, and I'm just giving you a basic thumbnail summary of the article, is predominantly a real estate industry. It is an industry or a corporation that made its money principally from buying up low-cost inner-city housing and making it available to poor people. For the most part, African Americans in the inner city. The focus of the story is on Baltimore, is on Kushner Industries in Maryland. The company began in New Jersey, and it made a lot of its money in New Jersey real estate investments. At present, in Maryland, Kushner Industries owns and lets out or rents over 8,000 units, rental units. The cost of the apartments, the rentals, and from the article, the costs, the rent seems to range anywhere from $800 a month to rents up to 1,500 a month, 1,600 a month, something like that. In other words, these are significant rental income opportunities. And there are thousands of them. And all you need to do is take 8,000 and multiply it by an average income per unit. Be conservative, $800 per month per unit for 8,000 units. And you can get an idea of the kind of revenue stream we're talking about here. This particular article is extremely detailed. It's lengthy. And it goes into detail about the behavior of the corporation in dealing with tenants. And it's pretty revealing and pretty disturbing. The reason I call your attention to that, and I'm not reading paragraphs from it, although I could. I started to highlight a few paragraphs, and I really decided that it would be, a kind of overkill, because I think many of you can kind of look at this yourself. You don't have to go very far into this article until you get the point. It's extremely depressing about the numbers of people that they take to jail for back rent. The stories about people, single mothers with 3 children, who make complaints to management because things don't work. The utilities don't work. The heat doesn't work. There are rats. There are garbage. There's crime, whatever the problems are. And the unwillingness, it seems, of the corporation to respond in kind. I think, there is something to be said about the whole issue of the real estate industry itself. I find it very, very revealing, for example, that in the 1920s, when historians were looking back into the 20s for signs of the coming depression that they didn't see, many people focus on the real estate industry. It seems like real estate and housing have traditionally been the areas in our economy which really are flagship areas which give us an awful lot of information about what's happening or what's liable to happen to our overall economy. The first signs of boom or bust seem to be evident in real estate and housing. The fact of the matter is, what this article shows is that hasn't changed. I think all of us can appreciate that. If we are watchers of television at all, we've all seen these infomercials about the financial opportunities available to people who buy up low-cost housing, throw a coat of paint on it, and flip it. And we have stories or advertisements, infomercials, about these individuals who have written books about how to become a millionaire without ever leaving your own home by investing wisely in the real estate industry. There have been and continue to be a lot of fortunes made in real estate. And I don't think I'm off base to say that a key theme throughout seems to be the exploitation of vulnerable people as the driver or the basis for these kinds of financial success. Kushner Industries, this particular article reveals a situation which is no different. We're talking about an organization that has so much influence and so much clout that if you read this article and you read the stories of different individuals who are brought into court, who are sued by the rental company for non-payment of rent and dragged into court, that the courts regularly find in the company's favor. In fact, one of the things about this article, as is frequently true with New York Times major research pieces, is that you get an awful lot of comments, hundreds. One of the first comments that I looked at in response to this article was the fact that the person who wrote it said, as bad as the behavior of the company is, what really disturbed him more than anything else was the behavior of the judges involved. Invariably, they find for the company. These people, people who are totally unknowing, totally ignorant of their rights or of the legal system or of their responsibilities, show up in court without the proper documentation, don't have attorneys, don't have lawyers, aren't represented. And the judges and the courts consistently find against them and in favor of the companies. And obviously, from the perspective of the company, one of the things that becomes very clear is that an industry this large, with as many units as Kushner Industries has, can't afford to be humane. At least that seems to be the driving assumption of the article. People are dragged into court for seemingly minor costs, minor violations. But the assumption is when you have that many people involved, you can't afford to give an inch with anybody, because if you do, other people are going to want to take advantage of it. And so therefore you draw the line and you never vary from it. And therefore, from the outside looking in, the renter, the agency, looks ruthless. And of course, the fact of the matter is, it is, from one end to the other, an investment profit-making venture. But we're talking here hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking more than $1 billion in profits. We're talking about a huge multi-state operation controlled by one family that has now gone overseas. And I think I mentioned on a previous program this week about Jared Kushner's sister in China offering green cards to Chinese investors who would be willing to invest $500,000 or more in a real estate development in New Jersey that Kushner Industries is in the process of developing. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people living in this unit, in units like this. So basically, we're talking about one industry, one company that affects the lives of thousands of people. And when you read this, you can't help but be chilled. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Go to the New York Times, just type in Kushner Industries. Sit back, hold on, fasten your seatbelts, and read this article. I think you'll be disturbed, especially when you realize that almost none of these people, none of these tenants, know at all that the president of the company that they're dealing with is the stepson of the president of the United States. And as you sit and look at television and you watch the president deliver a major address in Saudi Arabia to the leaders of Islamic countries throughout the Middle East, and you see directly behind him on the podium Jared Kushner, and you see Jared Kushner and wife Ivanka in the Vatican meeting with the Pope and representing the United States of America and representing all of us. And you realize that the way they make their money is by, I'm being very blunt here, is by treating people as this article reveals. You can't help but be concerned. You can't help but wonder about the agenda of an administration, the agenda of the president, who has made his money in much the same way, in investments in real estate, in hotels and casinos and golf courses, in catering to the rich and famous around the world. And he is able to craft a message and go into the heartland of America and speak to people who are desperate and without hope, who can't find jobs, can't hold their families together, don't know what tomorrow's going to bring for them, and give them hope by supporting him. You have to wonder how real this really is. With that, I think we've just about reached the top of the hour. Actually, we've gone a little bit beyond it. It's about 4 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. And at this point, I really do want to get into the issue of the technology question, because I think it's a very, very significant one. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a short break, 5 minutes, maybe less. So I do hope that you'll stay with us. And again, I want to thank you for your support of this program and for the Head On Radio Network. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour, abbreviated though it is, here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Wednesday, the 24th day of May in the year 2017. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to the program and thank you. If you've been with us through the first hour, we spent the bulk of the first hour on a piece in today's New York Times by Thomas Friedman on economic development in Middle America. I think it's a 4-day driving road trip that Friedman took, beginning in Indiana, driving through Kentucky and into Tennessee. And it's an effort to look at Appalachia and look at some of the things that are happening and not happening in Central America in terms of the economy and in terms of education, and more importantly, to look at communities which seem to be making progress and trying to identify some of the reasons for that progress and sharing those reasons with other people, which is really what the article is about. My purpose in presenting it here at the Virtual Center, and my hope, is that people will use this as an example of the kinds of things that can happen when the pieces come together as they are capable of coming together. And I think that's what Friedman is talking about in terms of communities, public and private sectors working together, businesses and higher education institutions able to cooperate and communicate rather than to compete and struggle and disagree with each other over and over again, which is a lot of what we've had in this nation. So again, I really do believe it's an important article for the potential that it suggests is available. If you'd like to comment on that particular piece or on any of the others, I think the last few minutes of our previous hour we spent on an article in the paper this morning, in the Times this morning, about Kushner Industries, the real estate firm industry that was directed by Jared Kushner up until January, when he surrendered his role as president in order to take a position in his father-in-law's White House, in the Trump White House. It's a pretty graphic piece it's chilling. It's really chilling, especially when you consider where some of the people that are involved in this kind of business are sitting. I mean, they are in the seat of power in our country right now, and I think we have to realize that, which means we really must take with a grain of salt some of the things that we hear coming out. And we must be very, very, I think, very, very aware and very, very sensitive. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me, at gmail.com. That's W.A. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906 at gmail.com. Our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook in the search box at the top and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And again, let me kind of forewarn you, if anything happens between now and 3 p.m., if our stream happens to go down, there is a backup stream that the program runs on, which is called headon.live, L-I-V-E. So if you go to headon.live, you can pick up the stream, the alternative stream, should something happen with this one, which is what happened earlier in the week here with our Skype connection. I mentioned at the beginning of the program today that I'd like to devote some time by getting back to the issue of technology. I won't go back to all the material that we covered on Monday, but what I tried to do Monday was indicate some of the learning that I was able to experience as a result of teaching two sections of a course in history of technology. And what we did, or what I tried to do on Monday, and I'm not convinced, I think I said this yesterday, I'm not convinced that I did as good a job with it as I needed to. But basically, looking at the whole issue of the worldview, the way different people in different periods looked at the world, looked at the universe, and how they dealt with the issues of the material world on the one hand and the spirit world on the other. And one of the things that it seems to me is most fascinating and most important is to recognize that in the Western world, early on, during the period of the ancients, man began to separate and distinguish between the spiritual world and the material world. Aristotle did that. Aristotle was very aware of the difference. Aristotle pretty much put the emphasis on the importance of the spirit world over the material one. And there are those who argue that the reason Aristotle's worldview remained unchallenged for so long, up through the medieval period, up through the Middle Ages, was that Aristotle's emphasis on the spiritual world, excuse me, Aristotle's emphasis on the spiritual world, when contrasted with man's emphasis on the material world, meant that for the most part, his ideas and his thinking went unchallenged. And in the early period of Christianity, and I'm thinking here of St. Augustine. In his book, The City of God, addresses the distinction between the world of God and the world of man. The city of God and the earthly city, which is the civilization of the world that we live in and concentrate and emphasize increasingly. And what Augustine tried to do was fuse the two and basically argue that by understanding more about the world we live in, nature, and recognizing that nature is God's ultimate creation, that in trying to understand and appreciate the mysteries and the magic of nature, one can additionally or further appreciate the power and eminence of the Almighty. In other words, the power and eminence of God is reflected in nature, which is his creation. And as Aristotle taught, the fact that God's greatest, that this is the way the world was created, and Christianity began to preach that God's greatest creation was man, and it stands to reason that man's place of living was at the center of the universe, because man's creation was at the center of all God's creations. So this particular worldview, which was driven in large part by the writings and the philosophy of Aristotle, existed through the Middle Ages. This was the worldview. And it's with the application of science and the beginnings of what we call the scientific revolution that people begin to recognize that that view of the world is incorrect, that the earth is not the center of the universe. Rather, the earth is one of several planets and other bodies that revolve around the sun. And we all are familiar in our history of the way that the church fought and resisted like crazy this Copernican worldview. Because obviously, if the church acknowledged that everything it's been teaching for more than 1,000 years was wrong, then the implication is that there are other things that the church teaches that could be wrong also. And of course, the message from that is that God is wrong. Our understanding of God is wrong. There's no way that the church can afford to make such an admission. So consequently, the church fought like crazy. And when Galileo came on and used the telescope to create or to collect scientific evidence to demonstrate that Copernicus's worldview was correct, and that the earth did indeed revolve around the sun, then, as many of us know, Galileo was arrested and brought before the church on charges and forced to recant his findings in order to save his own life. But as we know, science continued to progress through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries until we get to the worldview put forth by Isaac Newton and Newton's laws of motion and the idea of God's natural laws directing the universe, controlling nature. And from that, of course, we get Newton's view of the world, which continues unchallenged up through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And in the 19th century, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, for the first time, science begins to be brought into the issue of technology. Man has used technology from the very beginning, finding better ways to do what he had to do. But with the scientific revolution and with the opportunities available in science to improve man and improve man's technology, then ultimately a defining factor of the Industrial Revolution becomes the application of science to the technological needs of man. And for the first time in history, science and technology are brought together in a situation of applied technology. And there are certain here's where we start, I think, things that we haven't touched upon before. It's very obvious that with the development of science and the application of science to the challenges that face man, that this becomes, in many eyes, a very expensive endeavor. And one of the things we find is that with the scientific revolution, science becomes a tool or a vehicle employed by governments, by the emergent nation states in the transition from the medieval world into the modern world. The applications of science at first are in weaponry and in the ocean-going vessels, the application of science to create stronger and sturdier vessels for longer and longer voyages, and the application of science to for military use, because the success of this would contribute to the power and influence of the state. Increasingly then, science becomes the product and the province of government and ultimately business, because business becomes a major supporter of government because of the stability and order that government promises in a world of commerce. This is prior to the Industrial Revolution, of course. But the issue that I would like to address is the issue of applied science that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. Because by definition, if science is expensive, if research is expensive, if becoming the patron of scientists and employing scientists is going to be fruitful, then obviously those funding it, whether it be governments or wealthy patrons, wealthy families, are not going to put their money into things which don't promise a payoff, which don't promise results. In other words, government support of science is an investment in contributions to the public interest, to government's responsibility to govern in the interests of its own people. So it stands to reason that science has to produce in order to continue the flow of financial support coming. Funding drives the research. And in order to continue the flow of funding, research has to be positive and productive. That, by definition, has implications for science and research itself. What I'd like to introduce at this point is a book that came out in the 1960s by Thomas Kuhn. We've talked about this book before. Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is a history of science, but a history which focuses principally not just on scientific development, on inventions and inventors, but more importantly, those periods in the history of science when research went so far as to find mega change or to create huge change, which constitutes revolution. An example would be Copernicus, because up until the Middle Ages, Western man believed that the earth was at the center of the universe. That's what the church taught. That's what churchgoers were taught to believe, were required to believe in order to get to heaven, in order to receive the sacraments and save their souls and get to heaven. They had to believe in what the church was teaching. And the church was teaching the worldview as described or defined by Aristotle, 1500 years earlier. When Copernicus came along and challenged this worldview and proposed what is called a heliocentric universe with the sun at its center, this so challenged the existent ways of looking at the universe that there was incredible resistance, not only from other professionals, not only from other researchers, but from institutions as well, from the church as being a key example. Because again, once you acknowledge mistake or error, then you open up the possibility of additional errors. And by definition, governments didn't want to do that. With that, I would like to introduce Kuhn's book. What I did in this course, given the shortness of time, I told the students, if I had been teaching the entire course, if it had been my course from the beginning, I would have required students to read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But with only 3.5 weeks left in the semester, the only thing that I could do was familiarize them with Kuhn. And so what I did was I went online and I found an outline along with a study guide of Kuhn's book. It was prepared by a Professor Frank Pajaris at Emory University in Atlanta. And it was a chapter by chapter outline of Thomas Kuhn's book. What I did was select 2 or 3 of what I thought were the most relevant chapters, reproduce the outlines, and put them on the Virtual Center Facebook page for the benefit of students. And as I mentioned the other day, since I was giving them a take-home final exam, and since they had the exam 2 weeks before it was due, then by having 3 or 4 chapters of Kuhn's book available to them on our website, on the Virtual Center website, that meant that as they put their final together, they could go to these chapters from Thomas Kuhn and basically use whatever they found fruitful for themselves in their own final exam. So what I'd like to do is share with you just some of the key points of Kuhn's argument. And I think I found it astounding. And let me tell you that I'm not the only one. When Kuhn's book came out, it was extremely popular. It was in the 60s and 70s. And young people especially were very captivated by Thomas Kuhn's book for what it said. Basically, these quotes are from Kuhn as put forth in this outline by Frank Pajaris. He says in his introduction, Kuhn begins by formulating some assumptions that lay at the foundation for the major contentions of his book. A scientific community, he says, cannot practice its trade without some set of received beliefs. These beliefs form the foundation of the educational initiation that prepares and licenses the student for professional practice, unquote. That's directly from Kuhn. The nature of the rigorous and rigid preparation helps ensure that the received beliefs exert a deep hold on the student's mind. Let me translate that if I can. What Kuhn is saying in his introduction is that if you are going to put students through a curriculum in order to teach them to be practicing research scientists, then the way you prepare them for the profession is to teach them the accepted truths of science. In other words, to teach them the universe as science currently understands it. Translation, truth. You are introducing your students to the truths of scientific research. This is what science believes. This is what research verifies. This is what you need to know in order to guide your own research. By definition, that means that a professionally educated scientist is the product of a form of mind control. He is not a trained professional that's going to go out there and find all sorts of new things. Rather, he's going to go out there and conduct research to verify the truths of things we already know. This Kuhn calls normal science. And this is the way he describes it. Normal science is predicated on the assumption that the scientific community knows what the world is like. Normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are necessarily subversive of its basic commitments. Research is a strenuous and devoted attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education, unquote. Research is a strenuous, devoted attempt to force nature into conceptual boxes supplied by professional education. It means that research, for the most part, is intended to produce predictable results. It's intended to verify or validate what we already know. If it doesn't, if you conduct research or an experiment in your lab and the results are not as you anticipate them, then you naturally conclude that you failed, that it's failed research. You must have done something wrong. Because the profession tells you that when you do certain things in certain ways, you get predictable results always. And the more research you do, the more you verify these truths, this belief system. The more you strengthen the confines of the box within which you train your newest generation of professionals. Let me go back for a moment to this question of applied science and the Industrial Revolution. One of the things that is very, very important during the Industrial Revolution is not only the application of science to man's technological needs, to the industrial needs of a developing industrial world, But more important than that, the Industrial Revolution is the period when science itself is accepted as a profession. When scientists begin to be professionally trained in colleges and universities, that there are acknowledged, approved curriculums, courses of study that scientists or budding scientists are required to go through in chemistry, in physics, in geology, in astronomy. In archaeology. By definition, then, these become scientific professions. The rules of the game are defined by the professionals. And students are put through a rigorous course of study in order to be taught the rules of the game, the world as the scientific profession understands it. Their mind is being trained. The box within which they will conduct their research is being constructed. And that's the way science as a profession happens. When things go wrong. When the research, and again, if it continues to not come out right, not only wrong and again, then you have come upon what Thomas Kuhn calls anomaly. Something weird. Something that the profession explain. You put it aside. You don't take it seriously. This is happening, but that you can't figure out what it is or you don't have time to try. The fact of the matter is, by definition, normal science rejects anomalies naturally. Normal science, as defined by Kuhn in his second chapter, means research firmly based upon one or more past scientific achievements, achievements that some particular scientific community acknowledges for a time as supplying the foundation for its further practice. Unquote. These accepted truths of science are called paradigms. These are the existing truths accepted by the profession, the existing paradigms. Because the student largely learns from and is mentored by researchers who learn the basis of their field from the same concrete models, there's seldom, if ever, disagreement over fundamentals. Men whose research is based on shared paradigms are committed to the same rules and standards for scientific practice. A shared commitment to a paradigm ensures that its practitioners engage in paradigmatic observations that its own paradigms can do most to explain, investigate the kinds of research questions to which their own theories most easily can provide answers. So, in other words, normal science deals in paradigms. The things that don't quite fit, the things that go wrong, are called anomalies. The crisis comes when the anomalies continue to pile up, and it becomes increasingly clear that the existing paradigms are somehow deficient. There are so many anomalies, so many things that the existing belief system can't explain, that the conclusion is that something's wrong. Kuhn says when that happens, when you get the accumulation of anomalies to the point that it begins to disrupt the profession, you are on the cusp, on the cutting edge of what Kuhn calls a scientific revolution. Because what the situation seems to demand is a new set of paradigms. A set of paradigms that will explain the various anomalies which the existing paradigms can't or don't explain. And it's the transition from a whole set of accepted paradigms to a new set of paradigms that constitutes scientific revolution. And that's the focus of Kuhn's book, examining the situations which led to scientific revolution at various times throughout history. Kuhn says, this is his 4th chapter, Kuhn says that doing research in science is essentially like solving a puzzle. Think about this. We all do puzzles. Many of us love them, are challenged by them. Puzzles have rules. Puzzles generally have predetermined solutions. A striking feature of doing research is that the aim is to discover what is already known in advance. Think about that. The striking feature of doing research is that the aim is to discover what's already known in advance. This in spite of the fact that the range of anticipated results is small compared to the possible results. But when things don't go right, when there are too many things that go wrong, then something must be wrong with the paradigms. Normal science, Kuhn says, does not aim at novelties or theory. And when it's successful, it never finds them. When science is successful, everything goes the way it's supposed to go. Nonetheless, new unsuspected phenomena are repeatedly uncovered by scientific research. And radical new theories have again and again been invented by scientists. Fundamental novelties of fact and theory bring about changes in paradigms. And so this all involves the awareness of anomalies. The message, that's Kuhn's book, pretty much, in essence. Obviously, it doesn't do justice to the book, but it's a kind of a summary of what scientific research is all about. And the reality is that the idea of normal science is linked to the important idea of the professionalization of science. By definition, a profession, any profession, is controlled, is regulated by the professionals. They make the rules. They are the ones that man the gates of entry into the professions. If you don't meet the demands and the requirements of the professionals, you don't get in. You don't get your degree or your certificate or your certification as a member of that profession. They can keep you out unless you go along And so basically the significance of Kuhn's book to many people was that it tells us so much about the world we live in, the world of institutions, the world of power and influence. The whole idea of change, how society deals with change, how society confronts new things and new challenges. By definition, societies are most comfortable with the expected, with what they expect to happen. They don't like surprises. Those of us who work have undoubtedly heard a supervisor or a boss make the statement at some point, the last thing I want is surprises. I want to know what's going on. Don't surprise me. The conclusion of this, in the minds of many people, is that meaningful change is unlikely to come about within the profession. The only way that revolution can happen is when it comes from people who haven't been trained within the box. People who have been educated and trained and become a member of the profession by demonstrating their commitment to operate within the confines of the box are unlikely to promote or even uncover the kinds of changes that are meaningful in society. The logical conclusion is the only meaningful way to change society is not by working within the system, but to challenge the system from outside, to become a radical, to organize opposition to the very essence of the profession or the system. Kuhn's book becomes a Bible of radicals. It becomes a Bible for revolutionaries, because it tells us how the system is designed to function. It functions in ways where change is predictable, where change is manageable. And in the eyes of many people, if the changes called for are revolutionary changes, then by definition, they aren't going to come from within, they must come from without. To students taking a course in history of technology, then, I have to ask them, once they become familiar with this book and with Thomas Kuhn, you've been through a whole course in history of technology. You've studied technology through the ages. You've looked at the challenges man faced and the way man addressed those challenges. You've looked at the way that people have reformed and improved the challenges in order to solve them faster, more effectively, more cheaply, more efficiently and economically. You've done that. So as you think about the ultimate purpose of technology, I ask you to look at that history that you've had through the eyes of Thomas Kuhn. What would Thomas Kuhn say was the purpose of human technology? Several months ago, I shared here at the Virtual Center a series of questions put forward by a professor of history at Princeton University some years ago. Actually, it was in the early 1990s, I believe. It was about 25 years ago or so. And what he did was compose 10 questions. And his whole idea was, this was in the honors history class at Princeton. And his basic operating assumption was this: any good history course is going to raise these questions, because these are the ultimate questions that all mankind must at some point in their lives confront. The third question in his list of 10 deals with technology. And as we approach the end of our program today, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to share this question with you and ask you to reflect upon it. How does technology affect our humanity? What is the relationship in your mind between humanity and technology? Here are a couple of sub-questions to assist us in thinking through that question. Does the use of some technology help make us more human, and other technology make us less human? Can the use of technology dehumanize us? Just about every invention is a double-edged sword, with the potential to enhance our humanity as well as detract from our humanity. Is that true? Is the answer to challenges caused by technology more technology? In other words, is the answer to our major technological challenges, is the answer in technology, or is the answer within us as human beings? Is there ever a time when technology should be rejected because its negatives outweigh its positives? Are there people better able to make those calls than other people? If so, who? And how do we find them? How do we know who they are? It seems to me the factor at the root, at the foundation of every one of those sub-questions is what Pope Francis called the moral question, the moral element. What's best for humanity? It seems to me that the key issue is the extent to which technology must serve mankind, as opposed to the issue of technology driving mankind, dictating to the truths. In other words, the extent to which technology creates its own morality, its own system of good and bad. It seems to me that that's the danger we run into sometimes with areas like economic development, the challenges of economic development. The rules of the economy dictate what we ought to do, whether in fact it benefits mankind or whether in fact it creates problems for mankind. And then the issue comes down to what drives us. These are important questions. All of them are raised by the consideration of the purpose of human technology. I think these are issues that all of us need to raise. We'll probably be back to a few of them during our programming next week. But right now, it's time to call it a day, and in our case, call it a week, because this is our last time together until next Monday. For the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, and for Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On Radio Network, I want to thank you for your continued support of the program, continued support of all the programming on Head On. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of today and that you have a wonderful rest of this week. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to being back with you again next week here at the Virtual Center. Thank you very much. Be kind to each other. Have a great day.